Gresham College presents Illuminated Psalter Manuscripts by Dr. Sally Dormer, the V&A.
Good afternoon. Well, in this third of this mini-series of 3 lectures, in which we have thought about, if you've been here so far, you will know this, but if you haven't, we've thought first about how illuminated manuscripts were made. And last time we thought about a particular technique of illustration production, drawing, with regard to the messages which drawing communicated to viewers, with a special reference to the Anglo-Saxon period between the late 10th and the middle of the 11th centuries. This session is going to come at the study of manuscripts from a different perspective, taking a group of very lavishly illuminated and decorated books, psalters, as our point of reference, so that you can see, with respect to one particular text, the ways in which patrons and artists approached the marrying together of images and texts. And before I explain the frontispiece that you're looking at, there are 3 technical things which I need to tell you. First of which is that I'm going to be, in the main, reading you translations of verses from the Psalms, and they are all taken from the Vulgate version of the Bible. You should also know that the Psalms in the Middle Ages were not referred to by their numbers, as we refer to them today, but by their opening phrases. I have supplied you with numbers so that you are on more familiar ground in the transcript that you will receive. But my third point refers to numbering of the Psalms, and that is that the numbers of the Psalms as we know them today do not tally precisely with the numbers of Psalms in the medieval version of the Bible, because some of the Psalms have been divided and others combined in the post-medieval period. So I have given you the number of the Psalm as it was known in the Middle Ages in my transcript, and following that in brackets, the number that psalm relates to in our modern day Bible, so that you can find it, if you are so minded to do. Well, the psalmist is the man that you see inhabiting this initial C in a 12th century glossed psalter, which lives today in Lambeth Palace Library in London, which you might have seen in the manuscript exhibition there 2 or 3 years ago. The psalmist is pointing emphatically at the opening of the psalm on the right, which is Psalm 95 in the medieval psalter, our psalm number 96. And he's directing our attention with his emphatically raised right index finger to the opening lines of the psalm beside him, which urges the reader to praise God for his glory and extol him as Saviour and worker of wonders. The first 4 verses of Psalm 95 read as follows: "Sing ye to the Lord a new canticle." A canticle is essentially a song. So sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord all the earth. Sing ye to the Lord and bless his name. Show forth his salvation from day to day. Declare his glory among the Gentiles, his wonders among all people. For the Lord is great and exceedingly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods. Now, those opening lines encapsulate some of the sentiments that are most frequently expressed in the 150 Old Testament Psalms. Sentiments that, as you will see, ensured the Psalms' popularity throughout the Middle Ages. I thought I should begin perhaps by just reminding you about the origins of the 150 Psalms, which you will find today in the Bible, roughly halfway between Genesis and Revelation, in the middle of the volume, a single volume of a Bible. Well, the 150 Psalms are a collection of songs or canticles that were composed originally in Hebrew, and they were brought together in a rather piecemeal fashion over a period of probably 7 centuries or more. The earliest Psalms date back to the 10th century BC, which is when King David was alive. And King David, as you probably know, was regarded by many as the author of a substantial number of the Psalms. In fact, no less than 73 of the 150 Psalms mention David in their titles. And his authorship of these canticles or songs was promoted enthusiastically because, of course, it elevated the pedigree of the texts to assign them to royal authorship. Plus, David was an ancestor of Christ. He was also a fallible human being who had sinned and repented and been forgiven by God. So he was regarded as the perfect role model for all of mankind, men and women. And as you will see in a moment or two, images of David feature strongly in medieval psalters. Well, during the Middle Ages, the Psalms were made available in 2 main contexts. Either you find them in Bibles, as I've said, in the Old Testament, roughly halfway between the beginning of the Bible at Genesis and the end of the Bible at Revelation. And these are known as biblical psalters. But the other way in which you would have had access to the Psalms was when they were taken out of the Bible and became the focal point of an independent volume known as a psalter, where the Psalms were the most important element of the contents of the book, together very often with 1 or 2 other things like a calendar, some additional canticles or biblical songs, and special prayers which were often selected by the person who was commissioning the book, or for the person who was going to be owning and using the book. Now, it's independent psalters that are going to concern us today, and numerous examples of that type of book survive right the way through from the 9th century to the 15th century, which suggests that psalters were cherished and that the Psalms were cherished texts. There are plentiful references to men and women knowing all 150 Psalms off by heart. There's even one reference to someone who could say the Psalms backwards, which I think means psalm by psalm and not line by line, which again indicates that they were read frequently. So why were they so highly prized? Well, I'm going to start with a selection of psalters which introduces you to and suggests the main reasons for their popularity. The 4 categories of people who were most likely to be enthused by the Psalms will emerge through looking at these selection of books too. Well, first of all, scholars. Scholars, the majority of whom, of course, in the early Middle Ages at least, were churchmen, viewed the Psalms as texts that repaid fine-tooth-combed study and analysis. And psalters that were made for scholarly study lack significant decoration and illustration. And they may sometimes include more than one version of the Psalms. That's the case for this book, which is the least beautiful of the manuscripts that I'm going to be showing you in terms of illustrative and decorative content. This is a 10th century psalter from Cologne, which is known as a quadruple psalter, because each page carries no less than 4 Latin versions of the Psalms, arranged, as you can see here, in 4 parallel columns. The first 3 of the Latin versions in this book were all translated by the great Western Church Father, St. Jerome, in the late 4th century. And each has been given a different name in order to distinguish it from the other two. So on the left-hand side, the first column that you can see is known as the Roman version of the Psalms. And that was the earliest Jeromean version, which he translated from an earlier Latin version of the Psalms in circa 384. And up until the end of the 9th century, this was the version of the Psalms that was most widely circulated and used. The second column is known as the Gallican version, so named because of its early popularity in Gaul, what we now think of as France. And this version was translated from a Greek version of the Psalms by Jerome in circa 390 to 405. And this is the version of the Psalms that from the 10th century onwards in the Middle Ages becomes the most popular, and it essentially provided the basis of the Vulgate version of the Bible, which we use to this day in the King James Version. The third column comprises the Hebrew Jeromean version of the Psalms, so called because it was translated from a Hebrew Psalter in circa 390. And this is a version of the Psalms which you only tend to find in scholarly Psalters. It's the least usual of the Jeromean Latin versions of the Psalms. Now, the textual variants between these three Jeromean Latin versions are fairly slight. If you are good at scanning text and you read across the three first columns, you will see that there are only minor variations, but they are significant. And I've given you the opening of Psalm 1 on your transcript so that you can see the differences between the three Jeromean Latin versions. So in this book, that leaves the fourth column, which you can see is really quite different from the other three to its left. And this is another Latin version of the Psalms, but it's non-Jeromean. Now, all four versions of the Psalms here keep in careful step with one another in terms of their layout. You can see each verse begins at exactly the same point, in order that an investigating scholar could make easy cross-references between the four versions on each page of this Psalter. Now, multiple versions Psalters tend to be the exception rather than the rule, but I felt I had to show you a page from this Psalter, known as the Eadwin Psalter, which lives today in Trinity College Library in Cambridge, but was made in the middle of the 12th century at Christ Church Priory in Canterbury. I have shown you a portrait from the back of this book of the man who was probably in charge of its design, Eadwin, the monk scribe illuminator that you will have seen if you came to the first of this series of lectures. Now, this is a book, a Psalter, that seems to have been intended to contain every possible text related to the Psalms that was in circulation by the 1150s. It would have been, I think, rather ponderous and difficult to use, and it may, by the time it was finished, have become rather a white elephant. But at its outset, I think it was heralded as the Psalter of all Psalters. And this page enables me to show you what I mean. In this book, we've got the three Jeromean Latin versions of the Psalms, and it is the Gallican version, labelled with the shortened title Gal down here in the bottom margin, that enables you to identify it. It occupies a broader column of text than the other two Jeromean versions, the Hebrew version here and the Roman version here. They have slenderer columns, which signals to the reader that the Gallican has precedence. By the 12th century, the Gallican version held sway, and of the three here, it is obviously the primary version. But this isn't just a triple Psalter. In between the lines of the Roman version of the Psalms, you can see there are small words which are an Anglo-Saxon or Old English translation of the Psalms. And in between the lines of the Hebrew version, more text written in small letters. This is a French translation of the Psalms. So this is in fact a Psalter with no less than 5 versions of the Psalms, 3 Jeromean Latin versions, 1 Anglo-Saxon and 1 French. And as if that wasn't enough, the Gallican version is surrounded in the margin of the page here and supplied interlinearly with commentaries or glosses composed by scholars who had laboured long and hard over the Psalms, interpreting their content. So this is a book replete with information about the Psalms, meant, I think, so that you could make cross-references and analyse and interpret various verses in the Psalms as you wished. And it is a tour de force in terms of its design, bearing in mind that this is a book that was made before it was possible to use mechanical means to tabulate text or to justify text. I think Eardwin was justly lauded for producing this incredible achievement in terms of the organisation of text. And if you're wondering what that is in the bottom margin, it is a depiction of Halley's Comet, which was added in later after it had passed over the Kent skies above Canterbury. Now, in addition to scholars, ecclesiastics of every kind knew the Psalms intimately. As early as the 5th century, the Patriarch of Constantinople, a man called Junaid, refused to ordain any clerk who had not memorised the Psalter from beginning to end. And similarly, in the West, in the late 6th century, Pope Gregory I refused to ordain one of his pupils because he said that he did not know his Psalter. At the Council of Toledo in 653, it was decreed that all ecclesiastics should know their psalms. And in fact, if you had been a member of a monastic community, you would have said all the psalms through once, at least, as you celebrated the liturgy in every 7-day period, in every week. Because the psalms from an early date had been divided up into sections or divisions, each of which was apportioned between the canonical hours over the spread of a week. This 14th century Benedictine, whose name is Richard of Canterbury, you can see inscribed in abbreviated form above his head, here a full view of the page from which the detail is taken, must be the sort of person who would have been fully conversant with the Psalms, and who left this Psalter, which is known as the Psalter of Richard of Canterbury. It lives today in New York in the Pierpont Morgan Library, together with 14 other manuscripts that he owned, as a gift to his religious community, the community of St. Augustine's at Canterbury, after he died. Presumably this book was made for him to use privately, but he regarded it on his death as belonging to the community with which he was associated. So the Psalter of Richard of Canterbury, which was made somewhere between 1281 and 1334, which are the dates that we know that Richard of Canterbury was active within. Now, not just scholars and ecclesiastics, but temporal rulers used psalters too. Temporal rulers, emperors and kings seem to view the Psalms as an instruction manual from which they could usefully learn the skills of Christian leadership and perhaps be inspired by the example of King David. This man is known as Charles the Bald, although in this image he has a healthy head of hair visible beneath his crown. He is one of Charlemagne's grandsons, and he was Emperor of the West between 875 and 877. And when he commissioned this Psalter, which is known as the Psalter of Charles the Bald, which lives today in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, he may well have commissioned this with this purpose in mind, in order to use it as a kind of manual for inspiring him, warning him against the pitfalls of leadership, but inspiring him to work as a sound, just Christian ruler, just as King David had aspired to do. And you can see in this image, which comes at the beginning of Charles the Bald Psalter, that he is shown enthroned, holding the orb and scepter, the emblems of his power, but that directly above his head, and the curtains have been parted in order to accommodate it, directly above him, we have the outstretched hand of God, blessing him in his role as ruler. The Byzantine emperor, Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, who ruled up until 959, made his association with a Psalter in terms of learning from it even more explicit. The page on the left comes from a Psalter that is known today as the Paris Psalter, which was commissioned in the middle of the 10th century by Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus. It lives today in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and it's a book which was made in Constantinople in part for Constantine's son, who was called Romanus, who on his father's death assumed the title of the Byzantine emperor known as Romanus II. This book, as you will hear later, has a series of prefatory frontispieces which occur before the opening of the Psalms, many of which are dominated by King David. And here in the one I'm showing you on the left, David is standing crowned in between two personifications, which if you read Greek, you will be able to identify as wisdom and prophecy. And David is holding in his left hand a book that is purposefully open. The text on its pages is legible. It is an extract from Psalm 71. Verse 1, which says, O God, give thy judgment to the king, and thy righteousness to the king's son, that he may judge thy people with righteousness. And just to clinch the association between Romanus and this Psalter, which was presumably meant to inspire him to wise Christian leadership, it is interesting to note that Constantine gave Romanus a treatise which he had commissioned on the principles of just government. And that treatise includes the very verse from Psalm 71 that I have just read to you. So here a book commissioned by an emperor, a reigning emperor, partly perhaps to instruct him, but also to instruct and inspire his heir, who turned out to be a rather nasty piece of work. Rather like the Byzantine emperor on the right, who is variously known as Basil II or Basil the Bulgar Slayer. He was the Byzantine emperor between 958 and 1025, and his epithet Bulgar Slayer arises from the fact that he waged a successful campaign against the Bulgars, the ancestors of modern-day Bulgarians. And this page, lavishly gilded, showing Basil in the centre with an angel hovering beside him and Christ above, about to place a crown upon his head, comes from Basil II's Psalter, which lives today in the Marciana Library in Venice. Again, a Constantinopolitan product. And here, Basil, if you look beneath his feet, is shown upon a bejewelled footstool with his enemies prostrate beneath him. And this image, right at the beginning of his Psalter, would no doubt have reinforced his belief that he was divinely appointed and ruled with God's assistance, just like David, his biblical forebear. The Byzantine emperors often referred to themselves as vicars of Christ to demonstrate their very close special relationship with Christ himself. Now, so far we've thought about scholars and ecclesiastics and temporal rulers, but the most lavishly decorated and illustrated psalters that have survived from the Middle Ages belong to a fourth category of psalm enthusiasts. And these are men and women, many of them lay men and women, so not men and women associated in an official capacity with the church, who up until the middle of the 13th century, and in some cases beyond, used the Psalms for their private devotions. Psalters were very often used as prayer books by lay men and women. And a remark by Alcuin, the great 8th century scholar from York, who the Western Emperor Charlemagne called over to the continent, where he became the abbot of the monastery of St. Martin at Tours, wrote a text in praise of the Psalms. It's called De Laude Psalmorum. And in this, he sums up the devotional appeal of the Psalter better than I could do. He says, in the Psalms, if you look carefully, you will find an intimacy of prayer such as you could never discover by yourself. In the Psalms, you will find an intimate confession of your sins and a perfect application of divine mercy. So the function of the Psalter as a prayer book is very important in our period. And many Psalters contain no specific information regarding their original owners. But I thought it would be interesting to show you two Psalters which were owned in the first instance by a member of a royal family, a queen, and the second by a member of the minor nobility, to show you that in the case of important people, socially elevated patrons, you do often find evidence within the pages of their psalters, either in the form of idiosyncratic texts or sometimes little images of the patrons themselves, which help one to deduce who a book was originally intended for. The full image on the left and the detail on the right comes from a book called the Shaftesbury Psalter, for which it has relatively recently been proved there is very little good reason to link it with Shaftesbury. So although it is still known as the Shaftesbury Psalter, you should put that connection out of your minds. Michael Kaufman, about 10 years ago now, proved conclusively, I think, that this book was made for a queen, Queen Adeliza, who died in 1151. She was the second wife of King Henry I of England. And she is pictured here at the beginning of her Psalter, which really ought to be rechristened the Adeliza Psalter, as a suppliant, respectfully outside the frame which encloses the miniature above her that is dominated by Christ in majesty with the symbols of the four gospel writers in the corners of the mandola or body halo with which he is surrounded. The woman that you see in the bottom margin used to be thought to be a nun, but Michael Kaufman has pointed out that nuns don't usually wear golden slippers, and nor do they have golden edges to their long trailing sleeves. This is much more fitting for a woman of royal status. And the piece of information which really connects Adeliza with this book is to be found amongst the texts, because at the back of this book there's a very unusual prayer, a prayer addressed to St. Lambert of Liège, who was a bishop of Maastricht. He died in 705, and he's a saint who is very rarely venerated in England, where this book undoubtedly was made for other reasons. But he was a very popular saint in Louvain, Adeliza's birthplace. And in fact, we know that a number of her close male relatives were called Lambert. So for textual reasons, backed up by the dress that this woman is wearing, I think we can be pretty certain that this book was made for Queen Adeliza. Quite where it was made remains a mystery, perhaps in Sussex, because she spent her latter days of widowhood after Henry, her husband, had died at Arundel Castle. The Lutteral Psalter, which was made circa 1330, contains much more explicit evidence about its original owner. On this page of a book which lives today in the British Library, you can see a knight on horseback. He is bedecked, as is his horse, with his coat of arms. So he's relatively easily identified as a man called Sir Geoffrey Lutteral of Irnham. He died in 1345, and he was a minor Lincolnshire nobleman. And he's shown here with his wife, Agnes Sutton, who is handing him his helm and his lance, and also with their daughter-in-law, Beatrice Scrope, who is handing him a shield. It's interesting that his son does not feature. But taken together with the very grand dimensions of this book, if you look at the measurements I've given you on your transcript, you'll be able to see it's much bigger than many psalters. Together with this sort of lavish illustration, which you find on almost every page, with border ornaments, line fillers, and illustrations at the bottom of the pages, I think it is reasonable to presume that Sir Geoffrey regarded his psalter perhaps more as a status symbol and a means of promoting his family. He was proud of Beatrice Scrope's familial connections, which is probably why it satisfied him to have himself there in this image with his wife and daughter-in-law. His son wasn't really necessary in terms of promoting his family lineage. So he may well have viewed this book from that perspective rather than actively saying his prayers from the book. And I said that psalters were the main devotional text up until the middle of the 13th century. This book dates to the 1330s. The reason for the Psalter ceasing to be the main devotional text from the 1260s onwards is that it was supplanted by the text known as the Book of Hours, a collection of devotional texts which includes some extracts from the Psalms, but much besides. And at that point, the Psalter very often becomes a sort of status symbol book rather than an active devotional aid. Well, psalters that were intended as devotional aids were very often richly supplied with illustrations, positioned at various points within a book. Sometimes they occur as frontispieces, single frontispieces. Sometimes they occur as narrative cycles of scenes, positioned prior to the opening of Psalm 1. Sometimes illustrations and historiated initials permeate the very text of the Psalms, and sometimes, as you saw in the lateral Psalter, illustrations invade the margins surrounding the panels of the Psalm text. And I thought it might be interesting, since we hadn't thought before about the connections between texts and images, to spend the rest of this session thinking about how Psalter illustrations were inspired. Sometimes you will see that they were inspired very directly from the Psalm text. Sometimes their evolution seems to have been by a more organic means of association, which is more difficult to pin down. But the words of the Psalms were incredibly important, and their relationship with images in Psalter manuscripts reveals a great deal about how patrons used their psalters. So let's start by thinking about images of David in psalters, with reference, of course, to his authorship of the Psalms. Now, from late antiquity onwards, it had been common practice to furnish texts with portraits of whoever had composed the text, the author of the text. And that tradition survived into the early medieval period. So it is not surprising that psalters are frequently embellished with images of King David, frequently accompanied by musicians, reminding the viewer that the Psalms were composed as songs and were meant ideally to be sung with musical accompaniment. One of the very earliest author portraits of King David occurs in an early 8th century Anglo-Saxon psalter, which was made at Christ Church Priory in Canterbury. It lives today in the British Library, and because it belongs to the Cotton collection, which belonged to Sir Robert Cotton, the great 16th and 17th century antiquarian, and because he organised his library in book presses surmounted by busts of Roman emperors, this book is known as the Vespasian Psalter, because it originally sat in the book press surmounted by a bust of the Emperor Vespasian. So the Vespasian Psalter today, together with the other Cotton manuscripts in the British Library, which has a frontispiece that you see here of a youthful, clean-shaven David. David, not wearing a crown, although he is wearing a halo, composing and performing a psalm. He has a little lap harp in his hands, and he's surrounded by an appreciative audience of musicians at the top and scribes on either side of him, who are scribbling down his words, and two little figures down at the bottom who are energetically clapping, it seems, as the psalm is composed and performed. Now, by the late 9th century, when this psalter was made in a monastery at a place called St. Gall, now in Switzerland, a monastery famous for its manuscript production and whose manuscripts still in major part reside at St. Gall. A number of David images are included within the pages of the Psalms. This is known as the Golden Psalter, because the entire text of this book, which was made in the late 9th century, has been written out in gold. It's an example of chrysography. I'm showing you here two of the 13 full-page illustrations taken from David's life that punctuate the text of the Golden Psalter. So on the left-hand side, David enthroned, this time crowned, with musicians and dancers surrounding him, and on the right-hand side, another significant moment from his life story, Samuel anointing David with an upturned horn. In the Eastern Byzantine tradition of Psalter illustration, scenes from David's life tend, rather than punctuating the psalm text, to be clustered together at the very beginning of the volume, prior to the opening of Psalm 1. These two miniatures come from that Byzantine Psalter commissioned by Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus for his son Romanus II. The book I said that was called the Paris Psalter. And in this book, it is known that there were originally at least 7 Davidic scenes that prefaced Psalm 1. There may well have been more. Some of the miniatures from this book have been lost. And I'm showing you 2 of them here. On the left-hand side, David is serenading his flocks. David is a young man with sheep and goats in the foreground. At David's shoulder, a personification of melodia or melody, inspiring his singing. And down in the bottom right-hand corner, a personification of the river, which is flowing in the foreground here. Another little personification of the spring, which is marked here, establishes the fact that this book is heavily influenced by classicizing ideas. And on the right-hand side, the scene you've just seen in the Golden Psalter from San Gal. Here, Samuel, bearded, is anointing the young David again with his horn of oil. By the 12th century, it had become more common, particularly in Western Europe, for David to inhabit the initial that celebrates the opening of Psalm 1, which in the Middle Ages was known as Beatus vir, literally, blessed is the man. The verse goes on to say, who does not consort with the ungodly. Here you can see David in what becomes known as the Beatus initial. Here's the B and the rest of the word down the right-hand side, the us abbreviated with this little tick above the T. You can see the lower B of this splendid golden Beatus initial is inhabited by David playing a psalm. This is a fascinating psalter that was made in the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem for a queen. It's known as the Melisenda Psalter. It lives today in the British Library, and it was out on display in the recent Royal Manuscripts exhibition. Queen Melisenda was married to King Fulk of Anjou, who ruled until 1143 from 1131. So this book was made at some point between those 2 dates. And it's a wonderful fusion, if you follow it up further, of influences from the Byzantine East, from even further afield in Persia to the east, and it has Western tradition too. In this instance, the inclusion of David as the author of the Psalms in the Beatus initial, facing, you will notice, the text that follows. So he is looking to the right. By the late 12th century, other division initials in Psalters are historiated with scenes from David's life too. And at this point, I need to explain what I mean by a division initial. I said earlier on that the Psalms had been divided up so that they could be celebrated through the liturgy in the space of a week. Well, I need to return to that idea now and to reiterate that the Psalms had been divided into sections in order to accommodate them within the liturgy. And the Psalms at the beginning of each of the sections or divisions became known as division Psalms. Now, there are different ways of dividing the Psalms. You can do it by dividing them simply into 3. In which case your division psalms come at Psalm 1, 51 and 101. But you can also divide them into 5 or into 8 or into 10. And I've given you again a little table of the division approaches at the back of your transcript so you can see how this works. But what you need to know is that the chunks of psalms in between each of the division psalms were of varying length. Some of the divisions were very substantial and some of them were much smaller. And by the 12th century, it was commonplace to use what is termed the tenfold division, which is a combination of the threefold and the eightfold division systems. If I haven't lost you by now, that means that the division psalms occur as follows, and you'll have these written down in your transcript. At Psalm 1, which you've seen already, the Beatus Psalm, then Psalm 26, 38, 51, 52, 68, 80, 97, and 101 and 109. Those are the psalms that people knew best, I think, because they were the division psalms. And they were embellished in many Psalter manuscripts in order to mark them out from the intervening psalms, which came within each section, so that as you flip through the book, you were easily able to identify the opening of each section. Most commonly, the division psalms were given historiated initials, as you can see here, for the opening of Psalm 26, which you can see on the left in a book called the Macclesfield Psalter, and on the right in a book called the Queen Mary Psalter. Both of these books date to the 1320s or 30s, and they're both English, but rather different in spirit. The book on the left you may have encountered because it was discovered in the early 21st century. It was hitherto unknown in the library of the Earls of Macclesfield at Sherborne Castle in Oxfordshire. And it was saved for the nation and now lives in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge in 2005. This book was previously completely unknown. It seems to have been made in East Anglia in the 1320s or 30s, and it's quite robust and earthy in its illustration. The book on the right is a complete contrast. It's a court product. Its name is very misleading. It is called the Queen Mary Psalter because in the 16th century it was owned by Mary Tudor. But its origins are to be sought, I think, at the court of King Edward II and perhaps his queen, Isabella. I think it is likely that either one of them commissioned this book or they owned and used it jointly. It was made in London. It's very refined, it's very elegant, very much influenced from across the Channel by French style, which is typical of much courtly English art of the 14th century. Now, both books are open here at Psalm 26, which would have been known by its opening phrase, Dominus illuminatio mea, which literally means that, let me read you the verse, the Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? Now, in Europe, in the 13th and 14th centuries, different traditions arose, dictating different types of scenes for the historiated division initials in psalters. In the English tradition, you rarely find King David cropping up in division initials, unless there is something in the psalm that prompts it. The title of Psalm 26 says that it is a psalm that was written when David was anointed. And so the scene in the historiated initial D up here in the Macclesfield Psalter shows David being anointed by Samuel. The title of the psalm has dictated the choice of the Davidic scene. In the Queen Mary Psalter, which I've said is a book much influenced from across the Channel in France, you have, by and large, a French approach to filling the division initials with scenes. And the French approach was to focus on King David. They were far more enthralled by the idea of David. And so here, for Psalm 26's opening initial, you can see that we have got a literal interpretation of the first line of the psalm. Lord, enlighten me. David is kneeling here, pointing at his eye, begging to be illuminated, enlightened, quite literally. And that approach to the division psalms is typical in France and in books influenced from France during the 13th and 14th centuries. So David is an insistent presence in the illustrative schemes of many psalters. Now, we've just seen how the initials in the two manuscripts, the Macclesfield and the Queen Mary Psalter, rely on the content of the psalm title or verse to prompt the illustration. Well, a literal visual interpretation of the Psalms was one of the most common ways in which Psalter illustrations were devised. And this was sometimes done very simply, as you've just seen, or sometimes with incredible complexity. And one of the most sophisticated Psalters in this regard is a book that you saw last time, the Utrecht Psalter, if you were here, a book made in the 820s at the monastery of Auvillers near Reims in France. Now known as the Utrecht Psalter because it lives in the University Library of Utrecht. This book was probably produced under the patronage of a man called Ebbo, who was the Archbishop of Reims. Quite possibly he commissioned it for his friend, the Western Emperor, Louis the Pious, who was Charlemagne's son. Louis was Emperor of the West between 814 and 840. And this book may have been made for him or maybe for his wife, the Empress Judith. Now, the book has very detailed, unframed, monochrome illustrations at the beginning of every psalm. And these illustrations are so adept at communicating the drama of the message and breathing startling life into the text that they accompany, that they have been dubbed by a manuscript scholar called Will Noel as visual charades. I thought I would show you what he means. It's an apt description using a psalm which I am hopeful many of you are familiar with. In the medieval Psalter, it was number 22, but we know it as Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. And I'm going to read you the Vulgate version of the psalm in translation with the illustration that prefaces the psalm enlarged at the bottom, and I will endeavour as I read it to point with the laser pointer at the different elements that have been drawn from the psalm text. So, the Lord ruleth me, and I shall want nothing. He hath set me in a place of pasture. Here's the psalmist, here's the place of pasture. He hath brought me up on the water of refreshment. He hath converted my soul. He hath led me on the paths of justice for his own name's sake. For though I walk in the midst of the shadow of death, little archers launching an arrow here towards the psalmist, I will fear no evils, for thou art with me. Thy rod and staff have comforted me. Thou hast prepared a table in my sight against them that afflict me. Thou hast anointed my head with oil. And my chalice, which inebriateth me, how good it is. and thy mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and that I may dwell in the house of the Lord unto length of days. Now, an exceedingly ingenious mind has translated what in part are very explicit visual phrases in that psalm, but in addition they've managed to translate more diffuse concepts into images. Images which you have seen have been woven here into a homogeneous whole. And this has been done with equal complexity in this book for every single psalm. Now, it's hard to know exactly how these illustrations might have been used, but it is generally agreed that they may well have been designed as mnemonic aids, by which I mean they were intended to help the reader, perhaps a lay reader of limited literacy, to remember the Psalms. If you imagine sitting with this book on your lap, and there is a full photographic facsimile of it in the V&A's National Art Library if you wish to do that, if you sit looking at the illustration, absorbing the content as either you or someone else reads the relevant psalm out loud, a subsequent glance at this picture, I think, would effectively have prompted the reader to recall the precise phrases of the psalm. Now, in the 12th century, the St. Albans Psalter, which was a handsome volume I showed you some pages from last week, was made at the instruction of the Abbot of St. Albans in Hertfordshire. Abbot Geoffrey had this book made for a woman called Christina of Markyat, who died circa 1155. She was a high-born woman who had eschewed marriage to become a hermit and a nun. And every psalm in her psalter does not have an illustration of comparable complexity with what you've seen in the Utrecht Psalter, but every psalm in her book does have a historiated initial. And some of them, I'm showing you one here on the left, are literal visual interpretations of the opening line of the psalm that it accompanies, whilst others are literal interpretations of subsequent verses in the psalm. So here I'm showing you the opening of Psalm 16. And in this instance, it isn't until you get to verse 8 of the psalm that you understand the relevance of this scene. Verse 8 provides the prompt. It says, "From them that resist thy right hand, keep me, as the apple of thy eye. Protect me under the shadow of thy wing." It's the psalmist speaking, and here you can see that a winged figure of Christ, an unusual Christ, is protecting the psalmist under the shadow of his wing, whilst the psalmist emphatically points with his left hand at the psalm. In Queen Adeliza's Psalter, on the right-hand side, the opening verse of the division psalm 109 has been interpreted literally with amusing results in order to conjure the scene in the initial. The opening verse of this psalm says, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I shall make thy enemies thy footstool." So here are the enemies, and here is God the Father, and here is Christ his Son sitting at his right hand. Now, a third approach to illustrating the Psalms was based on a typological interpretation of them. Typology involves juxtaposing an Old Testament event or figure with a New Testament event or person. The former is viewed as a prefiguration of the latter, and the latter is viewed as a fulfillment of the former. Now, this was a familiar approach for studying the scriptures in the Middle Ages. And illustrations of New Testament events in Psalters are relatively common. They are typically Christological in their focus, which is not unsurprising if you remember that many of the Psalms contain prophecies of the promised Messiah, a descendant of King David. Here we're back in the Utrecht Psalter, and the illustration for Psalm 15 includes two Christological scenes. The scene known as the harrowing of hell on the left, where Christ descends to the dead after his death and rescues from limbo the souls of those who have died in faith prior to his coming, Adam and Eve included. And to the right, the scene of the Marys coming on Easter morning to embalm Christ's body and being told by an angel seated on the open tomb that he is not to be found there. Now, both of these Christological New Testament scenes have been prompted by verse 10 of Psalm 15, which says, "Because thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, nor wilt thou give thy Holy One to see corruption." So here the soul is not being left in hell, a reference to Christ, and here Christ's body was not corrupt. He was risen to new life. So the scene of the resurrection, which this is taken to be, has been included. In frugally illustrated psalters, Christological frontispieces, often the crucifixion, were common, since Christ's sacrifice was the culmination of his ministry and passion, and an event that was frequently alluded to in the Psalms. So this, no doubt, influenced the decision in both the late 10th century Ramsey Psalter, made at Winchester, now in the British Library, which you saw last time with the exquisite drawn frontispiece on the left, a book made for Oswald, the Archbishop of York, in the late 10th century, and on the right, a mid-13th century Psalter, known as the Evesham Psalter, which is also today in the British Library, and which was made for an abbot at Evesham Abbey, who is shown kneeling as a suppliant at the foot of the cross. Both of these books only contain one illustration, a frontispiece of the crucifixion. And the continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament, which is what typology is all about, underpins the eloquence of the Beatus initial in Queen Adeliza's Psalter on the left, where King David occupies the upper bowl of the bee and gazes upwards across space and time to his descendant, Christ, who rules supreme at the apex of the composition, flanked by the symbols of the evangelists. And I think the same intention is dictated the frequent insertion of a scene known as the Tree of Jesse into the Beatus initial of many late medieval psalters. A Tree of Jesse is a genealogical family tree of Christ and David, beginning with David's father Jesse, who reclines, and then through his groin springs a tree within which you have his descendants, including here Mary, Christ himself, here crucified, and here in majesty. This is a 14th century East Anglian psalter again, known as the Galston Psalter, that lives in the British Library. Now, these examples I've shown you so far of Christological imagery are very compact, but the most popular approach to illustrating the Psalter from the late 11th century onwards in the West was to include huge amounts of Christological imagery prior to the opening of Psalm 1, accommodating it in long prefatory cycles. The earliest example of this occurs in a book I showed you last time again, called the Tiberius Psalter, a book made at Winchester just before the conquest in 1066. and a book which has no less than 11 scenes from the life of Christ, of which these are 2, the crucifixion on the left and the harrowing of hell again on the right, which preface Psalm 1, together with some David scenes too. There are 5 David scenes and 11 Christological scenes in the Tiberius Psalter. This book seems to have provided the impetus for a fashion that springs into life in the 1120s and can be first seen in Christina of Marquette's Psalter, the St. Albans Psalter, made for her, as I said before, by Abbot Geoffrey of St. Albans, the book that is now in Hildesheim in northern Germany. Whoever was responsible for designing this book may well have known about the Tiberius Psalter, and at a distance of about 70 years picked up on the idea of a Christological prefatory cycle of scenes, but really went to town with it. This book, made for Christina of Marquette, who may well have only been semi-literate, has no less than 32 fully painted, full-page miniatures preceding Psalm 1. Only 3 of them are Old Testament in subject. The rest, 29 of them, are focused on Christ's infancy, his ministry, and his passion. I'm showing you scenes on the left from the birth of Christ, the Nativity, where the ox and the ass are rather delightfully licking Christ as he lies in the manger, and the resurrection scene, the Mary's at the empty tomb again on the right-hand side. Now, a prefatory cycle like this, if you imagine 32 splendid full-page and fully painted, gilded miniatures of this sort with absolutely no text alongside them, turns the Psalter essentially into a picture book. And I think this signals that many Psalters were intended for patrons of limited literacy, such as Christina may well have been. And she no doubt will have enjoyed looking at the copious illustrations that adorned her Psalter, as well as learning from them. And I think the same can be said for books like the Queen Mary Psalter. As I said, perhaps commissioned either for Edward II, King of England, or his wife, or perhaps both of them, Isabella of France. And they were probably more comfortable with pictures rather than words. And the Queen Mary Psalter, which again was in that recent Royal Exhibition at the British Library, has a wealth of illustrative material. It has an illustrated calendar, it has historiated division initials, you saw the one for Psalm 26, it has over 120 pages of prefatory Old Testament illustrations, and barre de page scenes in the bottom margins of every page. And as if that wasn't enough, it also has a lavish cycle of the life of Christ, which runs through the Psalms, invading the Psalms. So here I'm showing you on the left-hand side the scene of Christ's baptism, which falls at Psalm 80, and on the right, the opening of Psalm 68, where you have got the marriage at Cana, the miracle where Christ turns water into wine. The first of the Christological scenes, the Annunciation, occurs at Psalm 1, and then you have a narrative of Christ's life interwoven throughout the Psalms. Now we need to draw to a close, but I want to mention one last category of Psalter illustration in terms of relationship to the text. In a small number of Psalters, text was interpreted pictorially with reference to historical events, public or personal. This is a page from a 9th century Byzantine Psalter called the Kludov Psalter. It lives in Moscow today in the State Historical Museum. It's one of a group of Byzantine Psalters designed with extra generously widthed margins. They're known as marginal Psalters. and they were purposefully designed to accommodate illustration. Illustration that could be placed, therefore, as close as possible to the psalm text with which it was connected. This little marginal psalter was made at the monastery of St. John Studios in Constantinople in the mid-9th century. That monastery was home to a community of monks who were vociferously opposed to the ban on figurative holy images, which included Christ, the saints, and the Virgin Mary, that was imposed on the Byzantine Church between 726 and 843. It's a period known as iconoclasm. Now, the monks at St. John Studios made this psalter soon after 843, when iconoclasm was declared defeated. And in part, they seem to have made it to celebrate the triumph of the iconodules, those who prized images, against those who did not, the iconoclasts. Now, these two illustrations to Psalm 68 that you're looking at illustrate the rich layers of meaning that could be extracted from a psalm. At the top right, you've got a Christological scene, Christ on the cross, he being offered a vinegar-soaked sponge to drink from. The man offering the sponge is shown with his head in grotesque profile, a medieval device for depicting an evil man, in this instance a Jew. Often this offering of vinegar is interpreted as a charitable act intended to assuage Christ's thirst, but in actual fact it was a cruel act. The vinegar was intended to revive the dying man and thus prolong his agony. Now, this image has clearly been inspired by verse 22 of Psalm 68, which reads, "And they gave me gall for my food, and in my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink." But in the bottom margin, there's a wild-haired man daubing an icon or likeness of Christ with a sponge dipped in whitewash in an attempt to erase it. And the Greek inscription by his head identifies him as John the Grammarian, the Patriarch of Constantinople, between 837 and 843, who was an ardent supporter of iconoclasm. His erasure of Christ's likeness is therefore here being visually equated with the cruelty of the man who is torturing Christ. And have you noticed that the patriarch has wild, unkempt hair? And in the language of Byzantine image making, this signals his lack of holiness. Now, given the fervour with which the Studios monks repudiated iconoclasm and celebrated its demise in 843, I think we can also surmise that the sentiments of verse 28 in Psalm 68 were applied to the iconoclasts like John the Grammarian too. That says, "Let them be blotted out of the book of the living, and with the just let them not be written." Now, in the Clodagh Psalter, this is a very explicit historical scene. In this image from Psalm 50 in the Utrecht Psalter, it is more difficult to be sure that a historical event is being referenced, but it may well be. Psalm 50 has an illustration dominated by verses 2 to 4, which read, "When Nathan the prophet came to him," David, "after he had sinned with Bathsheba. Have mercy on me, O God, according to thy great mercy, and according to the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my iniquity." Nathan is shown gesturing dramatically towards David, who stands awkwardly, literally caught between God's messenger and Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, with whom David committed adultery. Bathsheba's husband was sent into the front line of battle by Uriah, where he was by David, and here is Uriah with blood pouring from his mouth, dead, directly beneath the guilty adulterous couple. Now, if this book was made for the Emperor Louis the Pious, as I suggested earlier, or his wife Judith, this picture may well not just be derived from the verses of Psalm 50 itself, but allude to a nearly contemporary event. Louis, when he married Judith, who was his second wife, had become embroiled in controversy with the church, who opposed his marriage in 819. And it is possible that this illustration, set at the beginning of one of a group of 7 psalms, which are known as the penitential psalms, because they are united in their central message of man's need for repentance and God's assurance of forgiveness, was meant to admonish Louis and Judith, perhaps, and encourage them to repent for a very personal sin. Now, my last image, you can read the fuller version in the transcript, concludes with a large category of Psalter illustration which is not obviously connected with the Psalms at all, and may only be connected by association, but it is always worth searching for the association, however tenuous it might appear to be. My last pair of images comes from the Macclesfield Psalter, with a marginal image of a little man backing away in horror from a gigantic skate. This can perhaps be interpreted on a number of levels, again demonstrating the very complex and rich approach to illustrating the Psalms in the medieval period. Taken at face value, this is simply playful. It's an image that would have distracted the reader for a moment from the hard grind of saying his prayers and prompted a smile. It's amusing. The skate must surely, I think, indicate the artist's familiarity with fish caught off the East Anglian coast, where skate abounds to this day, I'm told. But look more closely, and a textual justification for the scene does emerge. Psalm 45, verse 3, which is what sits directly above the little man and the fish, reads as follows: "Therefore we will not fear, when the earth shall be troubled and the mountains shall be removed into the heart of the sea." I think this scene is intended to comfort the reader as well as amuse him, perhaps, to reassure him that nothing, even the prospect of confronting a giant fish, prompted presumably by the reference to the sea in the verse, is too big a problem for God. So to conclude, the Psalms are endlessly fascinating texts, and illustrated psalters, even though I've only shown you 20 or so, better than any other type of medieval book, provide us with the chance to admire the multiplicity of and ingenuity of approaches employed to forge links between texts and images in the Middle Ages. Psalters were much more than picture books, even if their owners were sometimes tempted, as perhaps we are still to this day, to regard them as such. Thank you.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.